zero in on Tiananmen Square, 1989.
Yep.
What was going on there where the present government, the communist government, was trying to come to terms with the need for diversity, for greater self-expression, and for greater inclusion into what would have been a more democratic process? What went wrong there that could be explained in the context of how that dynamics was actually evolving over time?
Without having any access to the inner circles of Chinese decision-making, I suspect that many people at the very elite level of Chinese policy-making have felt that 1989 and what happened at Tiananmen Square and in the areas around it was one of the great policy mistakes of their time. And I think a very great deal of effort has been made in the 2 decades that follow to prevent any similar incident happening again. From their point of view, it would have been something that had basically emerged from a combination of social forces which they hadn't fully understood and hadn't been able to manage. And one of the most immediate causes of the protests in 1989 was the rapid rise in price inflation that came from a whole variety of economic factors, largely due to the fact that, of course, economic reforms had been going on for the best part of a decade, and perhaps inevitably they had created a price bubble. It's also, I think, fair to say that while the protests certainly demanded a new type of political engagement, it is not the case that the vast majority of people involved were actually looking for the kind of multi-party democracy that was reported in many Western media. This didn't mean that the scenario that actually happened in 1989 was in any way desirable. I think one has to regard it as a tragedy, but it does come from very indigenously identifiable Chinese sources, and the party has worked, I think, quite strongly to try and avoid those recurring.
Right. The reason I pinned down on 1989 is because structurally, they are walking right into similar situations today. Inflation is questionable. The official inflation rates are kind of low. The rise in property prices, the inequality in terms of income, and the demand for even unionization, for example, taking place from the ground up today. China can be expected to deal with the current demand somewhat differently from 1989. But I think, as you said, 1989 came, as somewhat of a surprise in a way, and they were not prepared to make that shift. But I think that the same agendas are on the table right now. Some reforms need to take place going forward.
I think that the situation is very different today. Don't forget that 1989 was only just a decade after the ending of the Cultural Revolution, and a lot of the people who were involved in those policy changes were very much feeling their way at the time. It's now more than 20 years later, of course. The youngest generation of adult Chinese were not even born when Tiananmen Square happened. And it's a very different China, one that's in some ways is actually much more connected than in 1989 through the introduction of new technology, but also one where the politics has changed in a big way. For instance, public opinion, again exercised largely through technology, is one of the things that really has shaped China in the contemporary era. And that means that policy decisions, even though they're not done on a liberal democratic basis, do take account of an awful lot of surveys and other factors. So to deal with the specific point about social unrest, I think the Chinese Communist leadership are both aware and indeed very concerned about the potential for further uprisings. We have official reports of more than 10,000 protests in China every year, and that's just the official numbers. The real numbers must be much, much higher than that.
Let me pose this question on you. At which point do you think China will come to a stage where it will require a multi-party type setting?
It depends very much on the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to manage the political system it has now. If it can institutionalize different types of public opinion and different types of difference within the system it has now, then actually it may be able for quite a long time to continue without formalizing party difference. I would say that one of the things that would be most worthwhile for the party to do right now is to actually liberalize the media in China. I think that's one of the areas, probably much more than actual party political reform, where allowing more space for differing opinions and for protests to express themselves would actually be useful in terms of allowing a sort of safety valve and also a feedback mechanism to the leadership. I think we have to be very wary about assuming an inevitability of a move towards a multi-party political system. And I know that the Chinese leadership look at a whole variety of other societies, both in the region and elsewhere, and find themselves wary in terms of the way in which some of those systems have developed. I think there's a great deal of debate, particularly in the next year and a half leading up to the next party leadership change in 2012, about the extent to which some of the pressing social problems of China, let's talk about pensions, healthcare, education, need to be dealt with. Now, China has one very lucky circumstance right now. China has a lot of money in the bank, when a lot of other societies in the world do not. If the party take advantage of that reality right now, they may have much more control over how they shape the politics of the next generation. Don't forget, the Chinese Communist Party is now the biggest political party in the world. It has 73 million members. That number is growing, and it's very tough to get in. You don't just fill in an application form. There are exams, there are tests. So right now, the party has an opportunity to strengthen rather than weaken its rule.
Final question. China is trying to make its shift from a low-cost producer of the world sort of economy and move up the value chain. That would imply a lot of dramatic changes in the way it views its own citizens, the diversity that needs to be represented, the educational system that has to be put in place, and so on. Do you think that it's a country that's structurally able to make that shift today, and the hard decisions that need to be made to make that shift?
One of the potential benefits of the current structure of Chinese government is that if it wishes to make particular changes, it has sufficient strength and autonomy to be able to do that. And that's been shown in terms of the economic reforms that have taken place over the last 30 or 40 years, and indeed many of the political reforms too. If you'd looked at the China that was there on Mao's death in 1976 and predicted that the China of just 40 years later would look as it does now, nobody would have believed you. So the capability and the flexibility is certainly there. The difficulty comes in that there are certain red lines still that the current government and the party finds it difficult to go across. The knowledge of where it's necessary to loosen up and keep the edges a little bit fuzzier, a little bit grayer. They do a good job in some cases. In other cases, as I've said before, perhaps freeing up a little bit on the media, they may be a bit too cautious. And I think if they can get that balance right, they'll do well. Certainly in terms of education, we have to remember that there is a very long-standing, you could say Confucian tradition in China, of valuing education, of valuing study above everything else. And in fact, it is often from China's educators, the teachers, whether it's kind of scholars at court or professors in university, that change has come in China. And therefore there is potentially the possibility for China's educated classes to take that journey yet again, if they're permitted to do so.
But that scholarly class depended on regurgitating, information that is fed to them, rather than, building a culture of thinking, as it were.
By no means. After all, until the very late modern era, Chinese science and civilization, as Joseph Needham, the great British scholar, showed, was at the forefront of invention in the world. Even as late as the 18th century, it was Chinese goods, porcelain, tea, a whole variety of very carefully produced and well-designed products that were being imported in their hundreds and thousands into Britain and France, which were looking for luxury goods. These are not things that a simple artisan culture can do. They involve an awful lot of scientific, technical and innovative thinking, and the potential for that is right there again today.
Professor Mehta, thank you so much for spending time with us. I think this conversation can go a lot more deeper. All the best in your book. I'll probably read that myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.